wird daraus, wenn der Buhne mal tot geht, wo landen diese Sachen? Wo landen diese Instrumente? Was wird daraus?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third speaker series of the school year. Today, joined with me is Seth Law, who specializes in application security. Seth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'll run it down in a little bit. I am Seth Law, at Seth Law on Twitter or the other social media avenues that are out there. I started my career actually as a developer and then moved into the security space. I'm in the Western United States and currently run a consulting firm, a small boutique that does application security, and we'll get into what that actually means here in a little bit. But I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Okay, let me just share my screen here. Per usual, we do take attendance. So let me just put the QR code up here for a moment. Here it is. So today Seth will be talking about the old and new in application security. I'll just give you guys a minute here. I'll also post the link in the chat. Alrighty. So I'll just give you guys some time to sign up. And yep, the link is also in the chat as well. Okay. All right, we'll just remove my screen, add yours. Okay, take it away, Seth. We'll just, yeah.
All right. So the old and the new of application security. And I am watching the comments a little bit. So if you have questions as we step through this, feel free to step in, feel free to ask questions. That's the whole idea. Realistically, though, little deeper introduction of me. That's me. You can see me on the screen. You can see me in the slides. Yippee, right? Redpoint Security, that's what I mentioned before. That's the security consulting firm that I founded and I run. We've been doing that for about 6 years now, I think it is, I want to say. And prior to that, I've bounced around a little bit. I've been embedded with large organizations, helping run security programs, application security programs, doing penetration testing. I started my career as a developer before I moved into the security space. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is and what that looks like from like the old school representation here, and then what I've seen it evolve to. I also co-host a podcast, Absolute AppSec, on the right-hand side here of the screen. That is with my good friend Ken Johnson, who I've worked with for a number of years. And we talk all things application security, product security. We do deep dives into cross-site scripting, if you've heard of that before, or server-side request forgery, or we review the news, like recent news in application security and how that affects us on a daily basis. So check that out if you have more interest in application security. But otherwise, at Seth Law, as I said before, on the different social media avenues. We also have a Slack channel and other ways that you can get in touch with me if you have questions after this. All right. So that's who I am on a daily basis. This is what I really do, is static and dynamic reviews of applications, right? So this is a short, just kind of like rundown of what that would normally look like. This methodology, this like overview that we're looking at here is the result of many years of penetration testing and trying to get into applications, trying to discover what is wrong with an application, where security fits in that. And I want to talk about why I made it to this point and why we came up with a holistic review methodology for looking at applications and why we do that on a daily basis. So how did we get here, right? Like we've got modern applications, we've got modern application security, we have old school exploits, vulnerabilities, but also research that was conducted and things that we did 20 plus years ago that are still relevant today. And when we really start thinking about it, this is traditionally what I get from students, from developers, right? Like, oh, old school, right? You talk about SQL injection from years ago on the right-hand side here. So applications were missing security controls. They maybe used a username and password, but it was weak, right? The developers lacked understanding of security or what went into it. And, there were tooling deficiencies. Some of these claims are valid, but on the modern side of things, they say, oh, it's so much better nowadays, right? Like we have the security software development lifecycle. We're pushing left, which means we're getting closer to the code as it's being written from a security perspective. We have security frameworks, all these different things, activities that go into building secure software and secure systems. But my take here is some of that is actually wrong. We claim to do all of these things, but on a daily basis, I look at applications where it falls down. And I want to talk about why my thinking around that has evolved over time, and why I don't necessarily think that we're always in a better position nowadays than we were 20 plus years ago, just based on the devices, the applications, the scope of what we're trying to deal with. And then as we get towards the end of it, we'll talk about a couple of things that you can do, that I can do, like to help improve the overall community and security in general. All right. So first of all, my very first professional job after I got out of school was with a little company called iOmega. I don't know how many of you actually remember iOmega. I'd be surprised if you do remember them, but you've probably heard about them. On the left-hand side here, we have the Zip 100, the zip disk that made them famous. And I helped do some programming specifically on the website and what we would think of nowadays as developer tools or continuous integration tools for pushing applications out into the web space. Now, my first introduction to security was as I came on board with iOmega. They had an issue where all of the systems went down, and this is the early 2000s. If any of you have heard of Code Red before, the iOmega got hit pretty badly with Code Red, including the machines that they were using to build and manufacture zip disks, zip drives, and other things. And this was really their introduction to security on the internet as well. They had a large public IP space. This was fairly common back then. And their reaction to getting hit by Code Red was to implement a firewall or introduce a firewall onto their network to prevent these worms from spreading, which is not in and of itself a bad thing. What I've come to realize then, though, over time, is the way they started to look at security was not as a software problem, but as a network problem. And because of this, they shunted all security activities under IT and under networking in general, which caused additional problems over time. So after I'd been there for a couple of years, we actually got hit by a SQL injection bug on the website, on the login form, where somebody went into the username field, put in an or 1 = 1 into the username, and it actually killed the database behind the scenes because it tried to load too many users into memory. And I know this probably wouldn't happen nowadays, but it tried to load too many users into memory to return this select statement of looking up the username with the or 1 = 1 tag associated with it, and it crashed the web server. And that was my first real introduction into the separation between network security and application security. So the organization itself had jumped straight into, oh, we need to secure things. Here's a bunch of money. We're going to give that to the networking team. We're going to implement these firewalls, and we're not going to ever have security problems again. And just a couple of years later, again, they had SQL injection. They had another problem that popped up. And it started to become a question of, where do we address this? Where do we jump in? And where does the security team actually fit in that conversation? Because it was so far removed from the development of the website, of the product, of anything that had to do with iOmega in general. And that was my introduction. And I jumped from there to a location that a bank, a large bank in the Western United States, helped them build out their security team. And, it's informed my thinking ever since. But then versus now, right? You want to say that we do it better now, that we have security built into across the organization. But I would argue that security is still a point solution in most organizations. It's shunted under, probably the wrong place, whether that is under IT still, or networking, or security doesn't report up to management. It's a portion of, the engineering organization or something else, but doesn't necessarily have the effectiveness of what we need it to be. But that's partially to blame on the security or on the organizations themselves, right? They want to measure security. And so they've looked to these different measurements to do that, whether that's attacks prevented, right? Security bugs found, patches made, costs reduced. And all of those are great things to actually measure and give you some feedback, but they don't necessarily represent real security as we, are trying to build that into software. So over the course of my life, my career, there's a number of different exploits that I want to talk about, or different vulnerabilities that I found over time. These vulnerabilities, we're going to look initially at what it looked like when I found them, right? And this can go back a number of years, and then we're going to compare that to things that I've seen over the last month to 2 months. And you'll see the comparisons, how easy it is to draw that nowadays we are not in a much better situation than I was when I was at iOmega. There are glimmers of hope. There are things that we are doing, but we still need to drive that further along. We need to, there's a number of things that we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation today. So the first old school exploit that I want to talk about, January 1st, 1993. Now, little town in Utah, college town. Anyone have any idea what happened on January 1st, 1993? Probably not. Here in little old Logan, Utah, where USU is located, this was actually the date at which point they introduced caller ID into, or US West at the time, which became Quest or AT&T. But the local phone network operator implemented caller ID. Now, why was this an issue? Because people could call you back using *69 is what they called it at the time. But this was the ability to actually return a call if someone had just called you. Now, as an enterprising young, not necessarily prank calls, Greg, to your point, but enterprising young teenager in high school, we were war dialing the entire local phone network, looking for interesting things to interact with. We were very big into the BBSs, the bulletin board systems, dial-up modems. We had games that we would play and log into on a daily basis. But there are all sorts of interesting terminals and interesting endpoints on the phone network that we could actually connect to, but we didn't know what any of those numbers were, and they were not published anywhere. But we had the utility to actually go out and scan this entire network, at least locally. We could have done it, across the nation, but we didn't want to introduce any sort of costs. But we were scanning the local city's phone network, right? We were performing a war dialing, an enumeration attack, looking for BBSs, we found sysop admin panels. So for those bulletin board systems themselves, ARPANET entry points, like local university had dial-up modems for students to connect to ARPANET, to the precursors of the internet. We found a lot of fax machines. Obviously, businesses were using those pretty heavily back then. Voicemail boxes where you could, call in, have people leave you voicemail, call in and check them. Long distance call services for different companies. So there was all these interesting things that we could drop into. The issue was that, once *69 was in place, if we were to scan the entire network, right, people could call us back and they'd figure out who we were. So hence that reason that date is stuck in my mind, because we were trying to cover the full network before that date before they rolled out that feature. But in general, this is an enumeration attack. I would look at it nowadays as almost like a forced browsing attack. Like, we know what those numbers are. We want to see if there's something behind them that we can actually pop out or see more detail in. And all of that was controlled by a single phone number in this case. Whereas, nowadays we could use a URL, and that was to access that same sort of information, right? So we would be talking nowadays more about broken access control. So, number one item in the OWASP top 10. If you've heard of the Open Web Application Security Project before, they have a list of the top 10 web application security risks, is what they call it. It's an awareness document. People should know what these different vulnerabilities are in order to protect against them, especially developers in general. But that's where this one would fall. It's a vertical authorization failure. I'm able to access some sort of service, without any sort of restriction outside of knowing that that phone number exists or that service exists. It's security through obscurity. But honestly, the next screenshot I'm going to show you here, it's like going around the gate, right? Whatever gate that they've put into place. But this attack that you see on the right-hand side of my screen here is one that, we found in an application within the last, 2 weeks, testing an API and different services or different organizations that used a specific API. The developers in this case decided that access to the settings for each of those different organizations would be controlled by a three character string, right? So if you were looking at the API / and I didn't actually show the response or the request here, the full request, but it's like the URL is the host name / API / payload, so in this case, CAT or NEL, and then settings.json behind that, right? And there was a number of kind of fairly sensitive customer details in that settings folder or that settings file behind the scenes. You'll see some of them are longer than others. One of them was dev, for the developers themselves, but CCC and CAT, the length on the right-hand side is showing which ones actually exist. But it only took me, 18,000 requests to actually figure out which of those were valid. It's a very, automated process, similar to what a war dialer would do. In this case, I'm using Burp Suite Professional. It's an intercept proxy or a Burp Suite Pro. You can use Zap or a number of different tools. You can even use curl to do this, right? There's so many different options in order to attack it. And if anything, there's more data that's available out there nowadays than there was previously. This is a targeted attack. It's not a spray attack like I did with war dialing, but it's a targeted attack. If I were to take the same sort of information towards Google and doing some Google dorking or search engine dorking, I could get out other results as well. But in this case, right, sensitive data that's being returned that was unintended, similar to the war dial attack that I did, 25 whatever years ago, however long that was ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever it is, 30 years ago, 1993. So that's the first one that I want to talk about, right? This week we found this, but we found it so long ago. What's going on? Those issues still exist. So the next one that I want to talk about, similar access system, but 1992, August 25th, we're going into, I think this was probably my junior year in high school or sophomore or junior year in high school. I know I'm dating myself. That's okay. You can see there's a little bit of gray here. It's, I've been around for a little while, right? But at this time, the local high school decided that they no longer wanted to call or require or send home notes to parents about missing attendance, right? So they implemented a system called ParentLink, and you can still find, further versions of this. This company itself still exists, right? But before text messages and emails, these things that I get now for my kids, this ParentLink system would call home whenever I or one of my friends missed school, right? If we missed a class, if we ditched a class, if we did something else, it would always call home. In addition, it provided this ability for parents to call in and get the announcements for the day, anything that the administration wanted to communicate with them. It was really just some sort of a little voicemail box system, but it was targeted towards education. But it would call your home number for those of you that have a home number anymore, but in those days we all did, on a daily basis if you were absent, and just say your son or daughter was absent from a class today. Fairly innocuous, but again, being enterprising, we're war dialing. They give out the number where you can actually call it up. And so we have a phone system, right? Number one, you've already seen that we've been playing with those phone systems. Has anonymous access, because you log in, you push one, you can get some sort of access back out. You'll notice it was before that January 1st, 1993 date, right? So, but there is anonymous access because it didn't necessarily track who was dialing into the system. It allows for interaction. Like, this is important, right? I can press one to get those announcements back out. And so the first thing that we did once we figured out that it was calling home was start to press other numbers, right? What happens when you press 2? When you press 3? Nothing. 8, it repeats the menu of press 1's for announcement, but that's it. But when you press a star, it asks you for an administrator passcode. All right, we're off and running at this point, because the next thing that we were able to figure out is that the passcode itself was only 4 digits long. Right? So if you put in 1111, which was initially the first attempt, or 1234, it would say invalid passcode, and it would hang you up. We had we've got our war dialing or our modems to actually do this. But this was a very manual process. And at the time, what we did is we split it up between the 4 or 5 of us that were, kind of the computer geeks at this point, and tried to figure out exactly what that passcode was. We didn't know what we were going to be able to do with it, but we thought it would be an interesting attack. Right? We found that it was 5642, which represents LOGA on your numbered keypad, short for Logan, which is where we were located. We should have known that that's what it was, at least initially. But once we were in there, it gave us a new menu, allowed us to do things like add announcements, reset that administrator code, restart the system. Now, this one becomes fairly important, especially when we don't want anyone, or we don't want the system to call when someone's been absent, right? We were able to ascertain that basically the secretaries at the school would load absences into the system when school ended at 3:25, and then the system would start calling parents about 3:45 as soon as it had some sort of a timing mechanism built into it. But all of those absences, that list was loaded into memory. It was not loaded onto disk. So what happens when we restart a system, reboot it? What do we know about memory? It clears it out. So memory it's temporary, right? So all that we had to do as students, right, at this point, if we were to miss a class or we ditched, we didn't want our parents to know, we'd call up the system anytime after about 3:30 and reset it. And the secretaries would think that the system was doing what it was intended. It wouldn't call anyone because it hit that time at 3:45. Notice there's nothing in the queue, and we were in free and clear. And we utilized this system we utilized this ability to reset the system for a good 6 months, 7 months that year, just to make sure that, our parents didn't know what we were actually doing during the day. It's, skipping some classes here and there, but it was a fun little, attack against a system. It was a brute force attack. It's password guessing, right? We really, this is not something that has changed that much. We've heard a lot in the news recently about password stuffing and credential stuffing. If you've heard those terms before, that is a similar style attack where you take known good credentials from breaches that have occurred in the past and attempt to use them on other sites, right? So if someone was in the Yahoo breach from a number of years ago, you've got an email address and a password associated with that that's been cracked. Now I take that and I try that at Facebook, or I try that at other places. So that's one attack that's happening, in the wild nowadays. There's a lot of systems that still don't have things like brute force protection actually in play. If the application allows for weak passwords, which a lot of them still do, and don't use 2FA, I mean, we've got mechanisms in place to prevent these sorts of things from happening, but it's still a problem, right? So we've got an administrator, like this is, one of the different password brute forcers that exists out there. Another one that I saw recently was this ability to register, like APIs have introduced password guessing or brute forcing into the system. This is from a test that I did probably 3 or 4 months ago, right? But you could register your identity with this system. Once you had registered, I could reuse the registration form, and you'll notice that in this case the error message is different. Right on the left-hand side, it says, "Oh, the user has already registered their identity." But on the right-hand side, it says the same thing with the additional information that the user ID and password combination I've entered doesn't match any entries in the database. So I know on the left-hand side that the password I used was correct, whereas on the right-hand side, it was not. And this was just a simple API call behind the scenes. Very easy to automate, very easy to run through, as long as I knew that his user had registered. There's enumeration that's going on with the username here as well. But I can get the password just by doing credential stuffing, common passwords. I can brute force. It's not to say that they wouldn't notice eventually, but it was through the registration form as opposed to the login form. If I tried to do this same attack on the login form, it actually would fail after 3 or 4 attempts, and they didn't give back that same sort of information. And I would get the account locked out. But because I was using the register page instead, the user wouldn't get locked out. So this is what I go back to, right? Like this fact that authentication is hard, and there's edge cases that we don't always consider when we're building those authentication mechanisms and those authentication systems for an application. So that's password guessing. That was a fun one. Okay. It doesn't look like there's any questions so far, so I'm just going to keep at it. I know I'm running quite a bit, but if you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. Let me know what you think, or we will open the forum a little wider as we get done today, as we're talking through some of the recommendations and things that we can do. So you'll notice here that we've bumped up like 30 years. So I was back in 1992, 93. Now we're in 2021. And this one is a modern / old school exploit. But again, it's one that I've seen so many times over the course of my career, and I see in most applications that we test nowadays, that I wanted to call it out. This one all starts from magic key. I don't know if anybody knows what the magic key passes are. This is the new Disney passes, season passes that were introduced in 2021 after quarantine. They were starting to loosen up quarantine. They were releasing these new season passes. There was quite a demand that had built up for them. And so they had a queuing system and a whole online mechanism that they'd put together to actually allow people to buy these passes. But the one thing that this did is, once you had registered with the site, you'd created your Disneyland or whatever account, you'd get put into a waiting room. Right? So this is what you'd see on the left-hand side here. This is what you would see in your browser if you had attempted to log in and you wanted to purchase one of these passes. I think they went live to purchase, it must have been like 10 a.m. my time or 9 a.m. in Pacific time, wherever Disneyland is, right? The kids wanted to do this, so we thought it would be a fun thing to do. Anyway, so you'd see that what this on the left-hand side, and of course I'm bored because it's just sitting there. It says approximate wait time more than an hour, over and over and over. It just sits there, and that little progress bar keeps shifting, but nothing's actually going on. So I look behind the scenes, and this is what I'm seeing from a response from the server itself. You'll notice about, down at the bottom of that screenshot on the right-hand side, you've got an expected service time in UTC. And the UTC, it's like 9 o'clock, right? AM, whatever, in UTC time. But the last updated UTC, like the current time for me, is 9:30 the night before, right? So we're talking 12 hours of wait time before I'm actually going to be able to purchase these passes. Now, this is untenable, right? Like, I don't necessarily want to stand in line for that long, or I don't want to monitor my browser for that long. And so I start to look around for, okay, are there any indications? Is there any way to skip this line? Is there a code, right? Like you're looking at, social media to see if they've actually posted something. I'm not seeing a lot there. But then I do notice one slight information disclosure on the left-hand side of the screen, or on the bottom of the screen, that is constantly loading. And you'll notice it there. It says status last updated, 2:27 p.m. Pacific time. But underneath that, it says QID, and it has a GUID value. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting, because that QID is probably, that's the gatekeeper to when I can actually buy tickets that I want in this case, right? So I'm just highlighting here the time between, when I can actually buy it, and how long it's going to take, more than an hour. I noticed the QID that's there, but I don't have a real good mechanism at this point to enumerate through or figure out what those other QIDs actually are, right? That's not something I can predict. These GUID values, that's why we use them. I mean, they're easy for a computer to generate and to look up, but it's very difficult to actually run through all the different values that are associated here. So I can't do the war dialing attack like I did previously. I can't brute force this. There's just no way for me to do this. But then I start to think about all the other people that are out there that are stuck at the same screen. So I go on Twitter and I just do a search for #magic_key, right? And what I see is, okay, somebody complaining. Of course, people are going to complain about this, right? Like, oh, I'm seeing this one screen. You have to hit it, 10 a.m. Pacific time to purchase. And somebody else posts like, oh, takes a screenshot of what they're seeing. And it says, thanks for your interest. It should open up soon. You'll be automatically out of the queue when it opens. But you'll notice that they also included the QID that was associated with their current session. And it's different than the QID that I have. So what do? I spin up another browser. I go to the site again. I log in. I search for that QID in the requests that are going to the API, and I replace it with the QIDs of those people that are on social media broadcasting those QIDs. And now I only had to wait like 9 minutes to actually purchase that pass. So I was able to jump the line in this case, right? I still had to pay. It wasn't like, and I actually reported this to Disney after we got done, looking at it. We had some contacts over there on the security team. But it was very easy to actually tie that together. And it all comes down to a trust issue that the server itself, the API, trusts the values that are being sent to it from the client and uses that in processing and assigning those queues, allowing people to get to the checkout process. And by manipulating that, I could change it. This was commonly known as a price fixing attack. In the early days of Amazon, they had issues with hidden form fields that had prices for products on pages, and you could just manipulate the prices, add that to your cart and check out, purchase a plasma TV for $100, which is normally $1,500, right? That was the common attack back in the day. But here, this was only a couple of years ago, and we see this over and over again. This sort of insecure direct object reference is what we call it, the ability to manipulate parameters that we have no business manipulating, but the server trusts that the client is sending them good information. So it's parameter manipulation. Insecure direct object reference is another name for this specific attack. But realistically, it's, the server shouldn't trust the client with those sensitive values. And they should validate everything that comes from the user, right? Right. And obviously there's a lot of other data protection rules that go into that. But that's that modern exploit that does go back in time. Again, we're just exploiting the trust that a server has with a client specifically. All right. So those are a few examples that I've got of vulnerabilities over the years, like what it looked like, years and years ago, what it looks like nowadays. So the question I have is, where did things go wrong? Where did we start to have these problems, and why didn't we anticipate that they would be an issue? One of the first things I did was just looked up, computer, security controls from back in the day, right? So back at the early days of computer science, and there was this report of Defense Science Backboard Task Force on Computer Security, also known as the Ware Report, about security controls for computer systems in 1970. And this is where I start to go down the rabbit hole of what happened. Did we anticipate this, and why haven't we prevented it from happening? And I know you could argue that we have in some cases, but right, like I wanted to see what people were thinking about 40, 50 years ago as computer systems were coming online. So I dug into this report. This is a very well-known report in the defense circles when we're starting to deal with these multitasking computer systems. In the recommendations and guidelines, at the very beginning of the report, after they've written it, if you're going into it, they kind of summarize this down, and it calls out the most difficult security control situation. Time-sharing multi-access systems. Okay, and stop me if you've heard this before, right? Time-sharing multi-access systems. Geographically distributed users, processing of sensitive information. Doesn't this just sound like the internet nowadays, right? Like they're saying this is the most difficult security control situation. These are the systems that it is most difficult to actually secure in an environment. And, so their recommendations, calling this out specifically, are going to apply to this most difficult situation. They run through a number of vulnerabilities, accidental disclosure, deliberate penetration, right? Active infiltration, passive subversion, physical attacks. Obviously, in a military situation, they're calling out some of the more physical attacks that go on with computer systems, and that's where they had a lot of concern about being able to sniff traffic and see radio waves and other things in order to access sensitive information. But they had closed that off in a number of these secure environments. But in this case, right, like on the right-hand side here, if you've ever seen a threat model that comes out of corporations or companies nowadays, this is very similar to what we have, right? Like, what are the attacks that are here? The radiation that's coming out of the processor of all things. Can we read that some way? Can we see the crosstalk? Can we, intercept the traffic? What happens if you have a malicious insider, right? Like, so all of these sorts of things they start to talk about, and they actually have controls that they propose in this paper to prevent that from happening. Okay, so the other two conclusions that were interesting, and I'll share these slides over too once I get done today with Yasmin, or you can rewatch things if you want to read through all of this, even some of the references to the actual papers behind the scenes here. But these were the two conclusions that were very interesting to me, right? Number one is, again, what we're searching for here is what happened. Why haven't we necessarily solved these problems? Because they've been around for a long time. I've seen them over the course of my career. I'm sure you'll run into it as you get into security and development and other things in your careers as well. But the first line of this conclusion here is telling to me. Providing satisfactory security controls in a computer system is in itself a design problem. And then they list out, the combinations that you need to provide comprehensive security. And then in particular, software safeguards alone are not sufficient. I would go a step further than that. It's not just software safeguards, it's physical safeguards or network safeguards or radio safeguards. Like, not one of these is sufficient for software controls. And then the other thing that I want to call out here is, it is unwise to incorporate classified sensitive information in a system functioning in an open environment. unless a significant risk of accidental disclosure can be accepted. I don't think most users realize the risk of accidental disclosure that they are accepting when they use these various services. We see breaches happen day after day after day, but that is like you have to be accepting of that risk when you use those systems. And so those were my two big takeaways from the conclusions. There is it's a design problem, and there is significant risk that we are accepting when we use these systems, when we build these systems, when we as a company or as an organizations create these applications and allow users to get into them, to use them, to function with them in this environment. So why do the issues still exist? I mean, we knew about it in the 70s. Why do they still exist today? I always kind of go back to developer education, right? A lot of times I'm happy that we're like having this conversation because, the extent of computer security when I went through school was something pretty non-existent is what I want to say. The security topics just weren't taught. I was taught this computer security was cryptography. That's it. Right? Like you can encrypt data, you can decrypt data. Here's the different like DES algorithms that you can use for that. But that was the extent of my own experience in academia for computer security. It has gotten better since then, but we still are missing this developer or system administrator or like just general computer user education, right? We get recommendations out of security that are too generic or too specific. This again this stems from the fact that security is oftentimes not located in the right place in an organization. Right? You've got security that's under legal for compliance reasons, or you've got it under networking because they're running firewalls, and then they have somebody come in and do a pen test. They give you a recommendation, but it doesn't necessarily apply to the stack that your developers are using, or they are very specific about one CVE that they found, but it doesn't necessarily address all of authorization or all of authentication. And then on top of that, you have conflicting advice. Go to Stack Overflow and look up, ways to prevent SQL injection. Maybe ask ChatGPT what it recommends to, resolve a SQL injection vulnerability, and you're going to get advice that probably isn't quite correct for the stack that you are dealing with. So what applies in one language or what works there does not necessarily apply to the next one that we're looking at. And then finally, if your employer doesn't take security seriously, why should you, right? You have so many other demands on your time, especially as a developer. Security it might be interesting to you, but it's probably down further on the list than the features that make the company money, rightfully so. But we often discount the risk that is associated with discounting security in that way. In addition, security tools. We often provide the wrong tools for the development environment for our systems themselves. Identification of a vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean it will get remediated. How many security items do you see on a backlog for development efforts? That's pretty telling when it comes down to it. And there is no magic bullet. There's no one security tool that's going to solve all your problems. And that's a difficult thing to actually explain to management. That's not what they want to hear, because security is an ongoing problem and it's going to be an ongoing issue. They would like to have, if I do this one compliance thing on a yearly basis, then I get that check mark and I'm secure and my data is not going to get exposed. We all know that that's not the case, but that is the story that the vendors come in and tell over and over. They may try to scope it down a little bit and say, solve all of your application security problems. Your network security problems by using our magic tool or our silver bullet, whatever it is. But there's all those edge cases, and the way that these networks interact and applications interact with each other causes other things to bubble up and problems to bubble up that maybe weren't intended and the vendor didn't anticipate it. So the question is, are you working with operations development and QA, like the whole organization, in order to provide those tools and provide that perspective? Finally, community support, right? Security in most organizations that I've dealt with does a poor job of explaining why and how, and they become the agent of no. So developers come in and they're excited to build this new application for a startup. The first security hire comes in and freaks out, rightfully so, because you're exposing all the customer data in an insecure manner. And so what do? They don't necessarily work with development right off the bat. They slap developers' hands and say, no, you can't do that. And they become a gating agent in an organization that prevents the developers from doing the things that they see their peers doing, that they see others, maybe even in the same organization, able to do, because they're dealing with different data types and they don't necessarily understand the why and the how of it. So security has not effectively communicated their issues with developers. Another thing, huge code base. You're coming into an existing company that already has a large application, and then they get hit with, oh, look, you're vulnerable to SQL injection, right? Like we're gonna send all these Jira tickets your way and tell you that you need to go fix all the security stuff, and now it's a critical issue, and I just blew up your next 3 months and you're solving stuff. And it might be interesting to them, but the way that we've communicated, again, is not effective in kind of building a relationship with those developers for a long-term and an effective security organization. So what I've come down to here is, why does this keep happening? And it's because security is an organizational priority, not a technical problem to be solved. We have a tendency to think about security as, what's the latest CVE? What is the latest technology or process that other large organizations or other organizations are using to secure their applications? All right, I'm going to do the same thing because it worked for them. It's a technical problem. I can implement that. And we have a tendency to focus on the technical because it's something that we can understand and actually push forward. Whereas security is an organizational priority. If we frame it that way, we start to think about security in a different way. We think about interactions and other avenues where we could promote security, and we could come up with ways to work with people in the organization that maybe aren't as technically savvy or are not meant to be technically savvy. Go into any law firm that's out there and talk about security and privacy. They can probably talk your ear off when it comes to privacy regulations, but oftentimes you'll find them with a sticky note with their password on top of it, because that's just not their specialty. So we've got to be able to frame this as an organizational priority and share that information back out. It goes back to education, and it also goes back to relationships. So all hope is not lost here. There are lots of good things that are happening across the board. OWASP Top 10, they update that top 10 list every 3 to 5 years, and it's becoming now more of a risk, like an overall risk control document or list. It used to be that it was very specific about vulnerabilities. So it would call out cross-site scripting or SQL injection. And I don't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing to call those out, but they're all under this same kind of heading of injection attacks or trust attacks that are happening. Same thing with those other vulnerabilities we talked about. So access control issues, brute forcing, right? We start to take a step back and say, okay, it's not just this one small, type of access control vulnerability, like the missing function level access control or the war dialing attack that we did there, but there's a whole class of vulnerabilities around this. And I need to think a little larger about authorization and access control across a system and across an organization, instead of just the one vulnerability that we are often hit with. Threat modeling, this is where that comes into play, right? Thinking across security in the entire life cycle, starting to build that in, where we are pushing left. We're talking with the developers more. We've got DevSecOps, developer security operations tools that are out there to test the security of an application actively as developers are building new features into them. all of this is going to add to the overall security of an application, of a system, but only if we have some sort of a goal, if we have some sort of a systematic approach to securing systems that fits our organization and the goals that have come out of it. And this all goes back to that relationship, how I interact with the developers, with the managers of the company, and then recognizing when I walk into a company whether or not they take security seriously. From a product security perspective, and especially as a small organization, looking at the different large organizations that I've worked with over the past, there's a number of them that are doing very well, or they're doing very innovative things in the product security and security space. Netflix is one of them that comes to mind, just off the top of my head. The way that they approach security, the way that their security team is embedded with the developers, works with the developers. Twilio, Segment is another, GitHub, like even some of the Microsoft stuff, but there's so many different divisions of Microsoft that it probably depends on the organization itself and where those security teams actually fit. But as you are getting into your career, as you are interviewing with companies, pay attention to that. It's not just whether or not they have a penetration testing team and you want to actually do the pen testing, do the red teaming activities, or break applications, looking for the vulnerabilities like I've shown today. That's not the only thing that you should be considering. Like when you're interviewing a company, going through that process, ask them about their security approach. How is security viewed by the rest of the organization? Because that's going to be very telling on how much you're going to actually be able to accomplish within that organization as an application security developer, or as a security engineer in that context. So what else? So look for those that support security and are excited about it. Chip in, right? Depending on what your current level of involvement is with development, it may or may not be appropriate for you to identify vulnerabilities, to call things out. But at the very least, you can start to talk about security, have those discussions. If you're involved in a new feature that's being developed for an application, hey, what are the security effects of this? Is it possible that we're exposing data that we shouldn't be able to? Are we handling things like credit card numbers or social security numbers? Talk about those security implications and just, become a part of that conversation. As you build those relationships, you'll find that it's easier to have that conversation the next time around. Realistically, what it comes down to is this: security is hard, try harder. That's what we're all trying to do. We're trying to lift the whole industry. But yeah, from there, that is my presentation for today. I'm wondering if there are any other questions, whether it has to do with my day-to-day, or if somebody wants to dig into one of those vulnerabilities a little bit further, or I can provide some extra links, other things like that. Yasmin, is there anything else that you wanted to?
Not at the moment. If you guys have questions, please put it in the chat. I have one. You answered a couple questions for me during your presentation, but you listed a couple examples of some of the interesting vulnerabilities and exploits you've encountered throughout the years. So I wanted to know, what is specifically your favorite?
Ooh, my favorite. So I have my current favorites, right? Let's see. I like. Okay, let me share my current favorite, and I actually did a post on this, and I'll show it in the screen here really quick too, just because it So we've got a blog, right? This is one that I quite enjoyed. This is where the intersection of like network security and application security comes into play, right? So basically, we had a system that was on the internet, and the organization had decided there was a portion of that application that was that should only be accessible to internal users. And instead of looking those users up to determine whether or not they're internal or if they were allowed to be there, they actually said, no, they have to be on the corporate network in order to access this application. But all they did was, hey, I'm coming from an IP address, right? And if the IP address matches, we've got a firewall, a web application firewall in front of it, and you're allowed to get to those portions of the application, right? But what I found was that the web application firewall and the backend web server, so it has nothing to do with the application behind the scenes. It's these two technologies in between. And the edge cases, I'll be honest, the edge cases are what I love about testing in general, right? Like this is where we find the super interesting vulnerabilities. But the web application firewall and the web server themselves allowed for a mismatch in encoding in order to access those URLs. So you'll see that I've got, okay, you can go like this user search function. They didn't want me looking up users when I was off location, right? But so it would redirect me to the login page or give me a warning that, hey, you're remote, you're not allowed to access this functionality. But I noticed that the big IP was what was responding with that and not the actual web server behind the scenes, which I think was Apache, right? So what I did was replace the U with a %55 in this next request, which is basically URL encoded U in the search string, and it allowed me through. Apache did the decoding. The web application firewall itself had a list of these are the URLs that you shall not access, right? And I'll redirect you if you try to access them. But of course, like %55 SER search is not one of those URLs, or is not one of those in those strings, right? But the web server itself would see the %55 and decode it and allow you to access that user search functionality behind the scenes. So that was my favorite one recently, right? Like I've got a whole bunch of these. I've got like, and I think Yasmin, you were in a class with me when I talked about like the football ones or the soccer ones, attempting to bypass the line to order soccer tickets or football tickets over in London one time when I was traveling there. That's a fun one too. I mean, I can run through that if you want me to. Yeah, Greg is asking, let's see, for the Disney Magic Pass, if 100 people had given the same QID, would they all be able to hold the same place in line? Talking to the administrators or to the developers, like the engineers over on that side, that's basically what it was. Is the queues were handed out in order, right? Those QIDs, and it was something like 200 or 300 people that would get the same QID. And then they would release those every like 5 minutes. Okay, this QID was first in line, so they get to order now. And then once that cleared out, it would go to the next queue, right? So, it was this rolling idea of, okay, you've got 5 minutes to use this QID, and then you'll still be able to come back in and use that QID within a specific amount of time, right? I think it was like a half hour or something like that once the window actually hit. So it wasn't as like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Like they weren't counting how many people were using those queues. It was more of, okay, you got assigned a specific QID. You have the opportunity to use it, right? Yeah, hold the same place in line. That's basically what it was, right? Like, it was an interesting mechanism they were trying to solve a problem of all these people wanted to buy passes, but their system could only handle, a few hundred orders at a time. So that was the system that they came up with. It just happened to be that they exposed the ID. Cool.
That's great. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I was going to ask something similar. Just you talked about how you first started experiencing or playing around with exploits, but I wanted to know what got you interested in pursuing this as a career as opposed to just a hobby?
So initially, like I said, so at iOmega, I was on more of like the development track, right? Um, and at the time, we didn't have the concept of application security. Like nowadays, security has like all of these different avenues that we can explore. I was helping do like the continuous delivery, pushing things out to the web server, and the regional bank. I had a friend that hopped over there, actually on their like firewall team, right? And they were fairly innovative in the security industry and were looking for like to build out a penetration testing team. And I was like, wow, I've been like, I love the development stuff. Um, but how interesting would it be to actually go in and try and to attack these systems, right? Like the stuff that we were doing in high school that was, we didn't really tell people about at the time, right? Because we're like, ooh, I don't know if this, like, we shouldn't be doing this, right? And nowadays it's a lot easier to do that, right? Like we can talk about bug bounty programs in a minute. But my path in was really this company that was local, this bank that decided, hey, we have too much risk here, and we want to know what's wrong with our applications and with our network. So we're going to build, red team. It wasn't called a red team at the time. They were talking about penetration testing, but it was shoved underneath, IT security. It wasn't, the security team that was under engineering. And it took a long time for me to get back from, hey, you're just like penetration testing, running tools um, like Metasploit, right, against a target or a vulnerability scanner, to, all right, now I'm back in the code, right? I've had to push my way back into application security because I started on, at penetration testing, and we didn't ever look at code back then, right? It was more of just the network itself. We would target an application and try to do things like SQL injection or whatever else, especially when it was a sensitive system. But it took a few years for me to get back to the code itself, which is where that, like, things like this other vulnerability I'm talking about, where they start to exist, and those edge cases. And we can talk about QA testing and how awesome that is, and how penetration testing is actually just QA testing, but we document really poorly when it really comes down to it. We don't do all the edge cases that QA does. So that's how I got into it, or that was the direction my career took, right?
Thank you for that. I just have one final question. So you talked about how the industry is very slow to accept the importance of security and how now it's starting to become a thing, but not really. You also gave some recommendations on how it could be better in recognizing the importance. So I want to know, in your experience, because I know your company is very into informing and teaching other companies about application security. In your experience, what is one thing that you saw that gives you hope in other organizations recognizing the importance of security?
One of the things that gives me hope is, so I mentioned like the Netflixes, the Twilios, those organizations that I've seen do it well, that they're talking about it. But honestly, what it is when I go in, there's a reason why I'm so energized when I go teach people, right? Because there's a lot of recognition there, especially not just from the security side of things, but from the developer side of things, or from the student side of things, about the importance of security, and recognizing that there are risks, but there are things that they can do. Seeing someone like, run their first SQL injection attack, right? Like, and the little like, ooh, this is super fun, right? Like I find this like injection, I can do all these other things that are unintended. That is what starts to give me hope, is seeing that fire that's lit across multiple people. And I know it's not everyone's, favorite thing to talk about. And, I have a soft spot in my heart talking about auditing of all things, right? Like logging mechanisms and how important that is. And I know it's not, especially in the security industry, it's like some of that stuff is is more Crocs and socks, but I do run into people that have those same interests. And it's so fascinating to see people take that and go further with it in avenues where I did not expect, right? Everyone's got their own background and their own understanding, and they find things that I won't necessarily be able to find. And that's great, right? That's what we need, because if it's just me or it's just like a few of us, we're never actually going to find those issues, which is why it's so fascinating to see the research that's out there. And so I guess my short answer is it's groups like this that actually give me hope that we're going to continue to get better.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah,
Thank
okay.
you so much, Seth. We are wrapping things up. So if anyone has any other questions for Seth, you guys can contact him through LinkedIn. Would you like to plug your...
Sure.
Yep. So LinkedIn, email, and as well as listening to your podcast
Absolute AppSec.
for more application security information and buzz.
And we have so we do live episodes every week, right? And we use like the same sort of mechanism here. So if you want to jump in and ask questions, we have guests that are coming on all the time. I think actually tomorrow Shlomi is on. He's one of the principal engineers over at GitHub, right? Does great work over there. So we have people on all the time. And honestly, I love to talk about it. I love to see people. AbsoluteAppSec.com is the site for the podcast, or if you want more information on the company, that's redpointsecurity.com. But otherwise, thank you so much for interacting and for listening. I hope it's been informative, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Just some announcements on my end. So we also have another speaker coming in for next week as a part of our speaker series. More information will be posted later on in the week. We are also looking for junior execs, though more information on that will be posted soon. So make sure you look out for that. And for more information, join our Discord, and we also have our YouTube channel and our Twitch as well. So thank you all for listening, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.